first of all, we're going to assume that most people have seen some of the state, so we can be a bit more free with plot lines and so on until we go through. When you started out writing the state, the idea, what is it you were really hoping to achieve?
Well, it was a bizarre situation in that I'd been making Wolf Hall for the BBC, and I felt a bit embarrassed about that because I've had a long association with Channel 4, and it seemed like a slightly disloyal betrayal. I was skirting the word betrayal, and I had a lunch with the current head of drama and her predecessor. And I had said, look, there's something I'd like to pitch to you. And they had said, well, that's funny because there's something we'd like to discuss with you. And it was a little awkward. I felt, as I say, I felt a bit embarrassed. And it turned out we were pitching the same thing to each other. And I think, weirdly, in that sort of zeitgeisty type of thing that does happen, we were all looking at the coverage of the radicalization of often quite unlikely people. And there was quite a lot of information about that, how they were being radicalized, stories of sort of schoolgirls being radicalized in their bedrooms on their laptops without their parents' knowledge. But no information at all about what happened once they got to Syria. And, you know, I started out as a journalist, you know, and mostly with my dramas, there's usually a sort of strong journalistic spine in there. There's a sort of desire. I mean, what can drama do? You know, it's always late to the gate, isn't it? You know, you turn a story around in a couple of hours. I turn a story around in nearly 3 years. It's not exactly reactive broadcasting. So we have to find ways to be revelatory. And I suppose I was thinking this is something that drama can do, which documentaries will struggle to do. There's one or two fantastic exceptions, but very few cameras got into Raqqa. News is going to struggle to do because it's a closed state. But with our off-the-record briefings, we can probably do something that even a couple of years down the road might still be revelatory.
And we saw an awful lot of things that you were revealing or reminding us of or exposing. But what is the message that you were hoping either people in power or just ordinary viewers at home would take away from this?
Well, I think there were two things. It had a twin objective, Fatima. The first objective was to say that as tempting as it is when these atrocities occur, either in the Middle East or now on the streets of some of our cities, to just say, well, they're clearly mad. Which is another way of saying they're nothing to do with me, I think. Tempting as that is, particularly when you've just been watching a news story of some appalling atrocity in the streets of Barcelona. Unfortunately, it isn't true in the main. I mean, there are exceptions, obviously. And then you get these weird stories that, you know, neighbours of people who it turns out have rented a vehicle and driven into civilians walking up some street somewhere. And they say, well, but he seemed really nice. He was nice to my kids, you know. And you think, well, on the one hand, you've got a sort of insane person doing an insane thing. And on the other hand, he's nice to his neighbour's kids. And it's completely understandable that people reach for these knee-jerk human responses, but it doesn't help us understand what is actually a very challenging and difficult phenomenon facing our society at the moment. So the first thing was to try, and I knew this wasn't going to be popular, to disabuse people of this sort of simplistic interpretation. The only explanation for why people do this is that they're insane. And the second thing was to act as a cautionary tale, to say to some young man or some young woman somewhere in Britain or in one of the other countries where this is going to be broadcast, if you have a kind of idealized vision of this caliphate or some possible version of it that you aspire to in the future, take a look at what the day-to-day reality of life there was actually like. And as you watch the disillusionment of characters who begin in quite a committed way and end up completely disillusioned, that could be you. So it was those two objectives, really.
And before the series began, you had some coverage that worried about glamorization and so on. I think once people had watched it, and when we look at the reviews, there was very little of that actually, and you've had excellent reviews. In fact, I think people have talked about it making you question your own prejudices. Now that's something that you'd be very happy with, surely.
Absolutely. I mean, what else should drama be attempting to do but make people question their preconceptions and prejudices? Yeah, it's very interesting to watch the shape of the reaction. We had to be faithful to the research, and the research made it clear that on arrival there was this fantastic sense of excitement, of belonging, of people who had never really felt they fitted in, or relatively recently come to feel they didn't fit in whatever Western European society they came from, suddenly feeling that they joined a band of brothers, a band of sisters. There was this sense of belonging, the sense of safety, of being able to be who they were without embarrassment or experiencing racism. And that comes through the research so strongly. So the episode 1 was always going to end with that feeling of almost of exaltation.
Which is strange because it makes you feel uncomfortable as a viewer, doesn't it? To sort of think, oh gosh, these people are having a really exciting time.
This is the challenge of the format. The format is that these 4 characters are our point of view. You'll notice that the camera never precedes them into a room. It always follows them in. They are our point of view. So if they don't understand something that's being said in Arabic, it isn't subtitled. And if they are feeling jubilation, exaltation, the film needs to reflect that. And that's the challenge of this approach to filmmaking. And there was, the predictable response to that. That's one of the reasons why I thought Channel 4's scheduling plan of running it over 4 successive nights was so clever, because that feeling of outrage really only had about 24 hours to gather steam rather than
it's quite a long time actually these days.
Well, as it turned out, as I discovered, yeah. But then watching response both on Twitter and also in the press over the subsequent 3 nights, it was extraordinary. It was quite gratifying, if I'm honest, to see. We're not trying to be manipulative, but there was a shape to the drama, and sure enough, the shape was picked up. And suddenly people were saying, if you look at the Twitter feed on the 4th night, it was boringly monotonous. It was, how can anyone say this is glorifying, Daily Mail, what a load of idiots, and some stronger language, which I won't repeat here.
We'll save that. Now, I'm sorry if this embarrasses you, Peter, but one of the better quotes from one of the reviews talked about you having a campaigning anger that scorches the screen and a commitment for making those in the corridors of power feel queasy. How do you feel about that?
I hate it when you read it out. It doesn't sound like me. I'm just a guy, who's been doing this an awfully long time.
But you do like to make people feel uncomfortable, particularly those in power. Where does that come from?
The thing is, I started doing this in 1980 in one form or another, and I've been doing it pretty... there's somebody here in the audience who I worked for back in 1980. It was... and that's what television drama was doing in those days. It was making these kinds of things that that kind of held a mirror up to society and, if I can mix my metaphors, asked some awkward questions. I've just sort of carried on doing what was prevalent when I started. It's just everything else that has shifted. So it's like the tide has withdrawn and left me on this little island.
Well, why have you stayed there?
Because I think television is an incredibly powerful medium. The current consolidated figure for the first episode of The State is 2.3 million. I think that's frankly a pretty astonishing figure, given the subject matter and given the multi-channel world in which we live now. And the idea, and cinema can't do this, the theatre can't do this, the idea that over the course of a few days, because there's some consolidated figures in there, 2.3 million people sat down and watched that show. Think of the power of that, Fatima. And we're all television professionals in here. Think of the power of it. And what do we use that power for? Most of the time, why not? I'm not saying everything should be a sort of head wrench, but most of the time we use it for escapist tosh. We just sort of, it's almost like that movie where, people are given drugs to keep them in a state of passivity. And I believe it's a powerful medium and it should be used to ask awkward questions of society. And, if we are challenging people's preconceptions, that's exactly what the medium should be doing.
Well, let's go back. I mean, you talked about your earlier career, but let's go back a little bit where, not talking about the state, but you see the state as part of a trilogy.
I do.
And it began with the Government Inspector.
Yeah.
Should we watch a clip of the Government Inspector and then we can have a little chat about that? So with the first clip, please. That is obviously all about the dodgy dossier, the sexed up dossier, whatever we want to call it. Why did you want to make a drama about that?
Well, I was sitting at home watching Dr. David Kelly appear before the Foreign Affairs Select Committee, and my father had just died, and he reminded me of him. And he was deeply uncomfortable, if you remember that occasion, but he was obviously a MOD insider, and he was incredibly uncomfortable. He was clearly following a line that had been given to him, and he wasn't happy doing it. And I think my heart went out to him, really. And then a few days later, he was dead. He'd killed himself in a sad little Oxfordshire bit of scrubby woodland. And I don't know, we all knew that story. It was all over your news program, everyone else's news, all over the papers, all over the stuff I read, and yet I didn't feel I knew what was going on there at all. And when you get a situation where you sort of feel the story is on one level very well known, but on another level not known at all, that's where drama can come in, I think. So the Hutton inquiry was convened. We got together a research team who attended the inquiry every day. We carried out our own research. And, in the fullness of time, I wrote and we eventually made The Government Inspector.
But when there is a story that we think we all know, and it's so politically loaded, do you feel constrained then in what drama can do, in what you can write?
Absolutely.
How do you get around that?
Well, look, the constraints are no different from the constraints in a normal factual program. I mean, you strip away all the different bits of wording in all the different codes, and what does it come down to? It comes down to don't mislead the audience, in my view. Because I mean, you know this, you make documentaries for Channel 4 News, if you juxtapose one bit of sync with another or put some emotive music over it or write in an emotive way into a bit of sync, you can change the way people react to, you can present the same bit of sync in two completely different ways. So-called factual programs are no different from drama. They all rely upon the integrity of the program maker, because we're all good at this. We can pull wool over the audience's eyes if we want to, but the audience and the broadcasters, of course, rely on us not to. And it comes down to this thing of, is it misleading? So when I'm looking at a scene like that one between, Alistair Campbell and Tony Blair on a train, I've got quite a few sources for what occurred there, not least the fact that they all talked about it at the Hutton inquiry. Yeah. And I'm looking at all this material, but I've got this show's is a single drama, and it's a Channel 4 2 hours, so you've got about 100 minutes to tell this whole story. So I'm thinking, if I conflate that or if I conflate these two characters into another composite character, is that misleading? Now, if the wallpaper was green and I make it red, it isn't, in my view, misleading. But if I represent a scene that was actually an amicable conversation as a full-on row, that's misleading. And in the end, I'm doing this without even thinking about it. Because I've been doing it for so long. I'm looking at this stuff thinking, can't do that, could do that. That'd be okay. And then, of course, there's people like Prashnaik, and the lawyers who you go to and they say, so what's your source on that? And you tell them, and they look at them, they look at the transcripts and they look at the material and they tell you whether you've overstepped or not.
Now, this was as much a British political story, but it was ultimately about the Iraq War.
Yeah.
How does what happened then feed into your writing of the state? Because that's what I think is really interesting.
Okay, well, that's a very political question.
I was going to go there, Peter.
It's a straight line from my point of view. I mean, the single most fatuous thing I've heard said in politics on this subject in recent memory is when Tony Blair said Britain's involvement in the Iraq War would never have any impact on radicalisation on the streets of Britain. I mean, it seems ludicrous now, but he said it with a straight face. And I thought, when he said it, are you mad? Have you actually spoken to any young British Muslims recently? Have you any idea the videos that they're watching, the conversations that they're having? They feel that the West is at war with Islam, with their co-religionists. They think it's a new crusade. And that's why I call this a trilogy of programs, this Government Inspector about the origins of the Iraq War and how we were, I'll choose my words carefully here, misled about the causes of the Iraq War. Brits, which was about the climate around the 7/7 bombings and some pieces of quite of security-based legislation that were brought in around that time, which many young Muslims thought were targeted at them directly. And now this small but unfortunately politically very significant trend of a small number of young people choosing to go out to Syria to join the Islamic State. For me, there's a connection, and these three films are a very, very small part of attempting to draw that line.
Well, you've mentioned Brits. Let's have the next clip, because I think that is a Brits clip. So that's a flavour of Brits. And the word radicalisation is bandied about an awful lot. What you try to do in Brits is explore the complexities of how that comes about. What was it you were trying to tell people?
That's hard to encapsulate in a short answer, because with Brits it was two films on successive nights. The story of a brother and a sister, and you saw Riz playing the brother, and then Manjinder Virk plays the sister on the second night. And what I was really trying to do was look at the nature of being second generation in a country like Britain. And I'm second generation myself, and I feel two opposing pulls within me. One is to sort of dig in and almost out-Brit the Brits, and the other is to overturn the apple cart. So I thought, well, I'll sort of take these two different bits of me and make them a brother and a sister. So Sohail, played by Riz Ahmed, was the sort of the conformist side of me, and Nasima, played by Manjinder, was the radical. And that's a battle that's been going on in me since childhood, really. My parents put me in public school, and then I ended up at a posh university, and those battles became sort of really, they defined who I was in those days, and to an extent still do. And although, this was a different generation and a different religion, I thought, well, maybe we can say something a little bit more sort of universal about the issue of radicalization by trying to look at it in the context of the nature of being second generation. And that's what Brits was, really.
You had those thoughts all those years ago. Do you think that the conversation has changed, is any better, has got worse around thinking about those issues? In terms of policy, I mean.
Well, it's got so much worse. Sorry. We're in a very dark place at the moment with Brexit and Trump in the White House, and white supremacists being tacitly endorsed by this individual who has his finger on the nuclear. I've got young kids, and this is a hell of a time to try to, talk to them about good values and tolerant values and the dangers of racism when they're seeing these images on the screen the whole time. I'm not condoning any of the, I don't believe violence is an answer to anything, actually. Haven't always felt that way, but I definitely feel that way now. And I can completely see why people are moving to the fringes, because there's a vacuum of, I'd almost call it a vacuum of charisma in the middle. Where are apart from Jeremy Corbyn, Bernie Sanders, and these sort of older people who seem to have, Bernie Sanders, I should say, sorry, seem to have, somehow sort of emerged in this extraordinary and rather wonderful way. It's difficult, I think, people look at the centre ground and it just seems so grey and boring and uninspiring. And this sort of fleeing to the margins is very, very dangerous, I think. I fear for our society in a way that I have never done in my life before. Sorry, that's a very downbeat answer. But,
yes, I'm not sure where we go from there, Peter. Brits then takes you on many years later to the States. And in the state, it begins with people at the border, at the point that they are going to join ISIS. We don't see any of their backstories. Why did you take that decision then?
Yeah, it's a good question. I hope it was the right decision. When I started work on it with my colleagues here at Channel 4, there was a huge amount of material about radicalisation. And I could foresee a drama in which we spent the first hour of the 4 hours we had available getting our characters to the border. And I don't think there would have been anything particularly revelatory about that. And I don't know if we'd have kept the audience. Secondly, I had, as you said, I've made Brits, and the whole second film was about a radicalisation process. And although it was set a number of years earlier, the actual process of, starting as a kind of rebel and watching a lot of videos and, coming to a decision, wrongly, I think, but coming to a decision that we would see argued out in the film, that violence was the only appropriate response. And I would have almost had to do that again with at least some of the characters. And then there was a third factor, which I haven't really talked about, but it is true, which is I would have found it very difficult to do.
Why?
Because I genuinely don't understand how anyone can conclude that joining the Islamic State is an intellectually justifiable thing to do. I don't think it's really about religion, because all the research suggests that most of the people who travelled had a very shallow connection with their faith. They were either recent converts, or they'd only really started taking an interest in their faith relatively recently. In fact, the more you know about Islam, the less likely it seems you are to travel. So I don't think it really was about religion. I think it's a deeper, more nihilistic kind of thing that reminds me more of the Baader-Meinhof or the Red Brigades or the Symbionese Liberation Army, God help us. People with a very absolutist view who have no investment in society and want to tear it down and not quite sure what to replace it with. I mean, it's interesting that I think I might have said this to you before, but some of the people who were arrested or were found to have left Britain to go, some of the men who travelled to Syria, when the intelligence services went into their houses, they found army recruitment literature.
I found that fascinating, actually.
Some of them had contemplated joining the British Army, which, if you know anything about the Islamic State, is a bizarre idea because they would be implacably opposed. And yet they had contemplated it, sufficient to go and get the literature. And this apparently happened again and again to the point where they were looking at it and thinking, was there some other significance, some code thing that we're missing here? Because they kept on finding it. And then in the end, they concluded a lot of these people are looking for adventure and looking for a band of brothers. Well, they didn't find it there, they found it there. So, yeah, I wasn't sure how to dramatize those characters. I thought it would be familiar. It might become quite stereotypical. What I wanted to do was take 4 people who were typical of the research and plunge them into this experience. I was much more interested in how a conviction that had formed outside the Islamic State would stand up to the reality of the Islamic State. That was what I thought would be new. That was where we had a lot of revelatory material in the research. And that was what I thought would be the best use of 4 hours of television.
Well, let's take a look at the state. I've got a clip. So there we are obviously seeing this band of brothers and sisters that you describe, and perhaps dangerous for someone of my background to say this, but I felt quite excited watching that and quite energised. We then see them go on to do very brutal things, witness incredibly violent scenes. And you didn't hold back on those. Why did you choose to show the brutalities to their full extent?
Well, I didn't.
But we saw.
I honestly, Fatima, I mean, the stuff I saw, you couldn't get it on television. It was always going to be a balance. On the one hand, if we depicted it as it really was, it would be unwatchable. Not only because it would breach broadcasting guidelines, but it would just be relentlessly bloody. Decapitations and amputations happening in Raqqa Square every day, several times a day, in that first period. But also, we were telling. Isn't an episode of EastEnders? We're telling the story of the Islamic State, a blood-drenched death cult, and to be, even sort of vaguely believable, we were going to have to depict quite a lot of violence and bloodshed, not least because, at least as far as Jalal is concerned as a character, it was that eventually, was too much for him. So it was the very violence that was a big part of his disillusionment, at least. So I was, I had a lot of help with this, obviously, from a whole variety of people in the crew and also editorially within the channel. It was about getting the balance right between making it unwatchable, but at the same time making it, a sort of ridiculously anodyne treatment that didn't acknowledge the fact that we're dealing with an incredibly bloody organisation.
And what was it like to write that violence to then go on to direct it? That process must be quite difficult. I mean, I know I find it difficult when we watched some of the original propaganda videos that they put out, and those scenes were very reminiscent of the kinds of footage that ISIS themselves were putting out.
As you know, they have a very slick, or they had a very slick media operation.
Which is quite chilling in itself.
Yeah. I mean, we're used to the videos from Al Qaeda and other, being very sort of grainy and rather crap, really. But not so the Islamic State, a very incredibly, scarily professional media operation. Well, I've been in this industry 37 years. This is certainly the hardest thing I've ever attempted, and I'm very happy to say bye-bye. It wasn't an easy thing to do. I knew it wasn't going to be an easy thing to do when I undertook it. It's a bit like all those years ago when I did No Child of Mine, and I had to read a lot of stuff about child abuse. Once you read that stuff, you can't get it out of your head. And you must know this in your work all the time. It goes in, it doesn't come out. I mean, you watch those videos and also read some of the testimony, like particularly of the Yazidis, the things that were done to them. The images that were conjured in my head reading those things will never leave me. But, a lot of journalists in the room, and this is sort of what we do, isn't it, really?
Let's take a look at another clip. Well, I mean, we started off with a very distressed mother talking to her son about going off to join ISIS, and she can't process this. I mean, you said you don't quite understand how someone gets there. We had this situation where Muslim families were facing up to the fact that their children had gone off and they couldn't grasp why their children had gone. How do you feel about the way all of that was covered? Because obviously you've watched a lot of the news footage around this and the sort of reactions of politicians to all of this going on. Do you think that they understood that actually some of these families are struggling too?
Well, I mean, I think your programme was a bit of an honourable exception, but in general...
It always is, Peter.
In general, I don't think there was much of an effort made to understand. And there was all this slight sort of implication that, well, there must have been something wrong in the home if... and yet through history, parents have wept in the corner while their children have gone off to war. I mean, there's a couple of scenes. There's a scene, in episode 4 where Jalal's father appears, and that's based on a real event, and that is that's where my heart lay, and that's why I had 2 scenes like that in the show. And I wanted to keep the pressure cooker of Syria screwed down tight. I didn't want lots of flashbacks. I wanted to get that. I wanted to try to echo the sense of being trapped that I think, at least 2 of our main characters increasingly felt as the series went on. So I didn't want to have too many interventions from outside. But I thought, partly because the description of this guy's father who had somehow managed to get himself to Raqqa and then was sent away empty-handed, I found that incredibly moving, maybe as a dad myself, and partly I just wanted some of those points articulated. It was quite important to me that, when you got to the end of the show, you didn't think that Jalal and Shakira were rejecting Islam. They were rejecting this warped interpretation of Islam. And that's why I wrote the scene, which again is verbatim from the research actually, of Jalal sitting there with Ibtisam, the Yazidi woman he purchased, saying he just wanted to go and sit in the desert and study with a sheikh. This was not a guy, as his disillusionment was growing, it wasn't a disillusionment with his faith. It was a disillusionment with the caliphate that was developing, and but I mean, I wouldn't want to. It's easy to be wise after the event. I remember the pressures of daily news. I know it. You could reflect and think, oh, we went with the herd and we didn't really see the bigger picture. It's in a sense, it's my job to come in and try and see the bigger picture. It's very easy to criticise television news, but I do think that there's a sort of racist thread that runs through a lot of it on this whole subject area. I do think it's getting better, actually, but I think back in 2015, it was there writ large, really.
Where do you think that comes from? Because I thought it was interesting. You sort of said, I look at this as a second-generation immigrant, and some of these people are second-generation immigrants. Do you think there's an inability to see this group of people, this community, as like me and you? Is it sort of seen as the other?
It's funny because the same people who exhibit that are the people who come in and say, I just saw this white guy arm in arm with this black guy on the tube and it almost made me tear up. You know, I think it's part of what we were talking about before, which is when horrible things happen, you know, there's a big part of all of us, even us squashy liberals, people like me, who when something truly horrible happens, you know, wants to sort of reach for the Armageddon switch, you know, wants to say, you know, some version of fuck 'em all, you know, excuse my language. It is a human response, you know, of anger and suddenly, you know, losing your sense of proportion. And I think the decision of people having watched the videos and, you know, known what was going on out there to leave their homes and travel was so inexplicable, and to some extent remains inexplicable, although I've read a lot of analysis about it, that, you know, there was this tendency to sort of think of the other. But I don't know that it was entirely racist. I think it was more a sort of gut response to something inexplicable and awful. Listen, you're getting me into dangerous territory because what people like me are very good at is sort of asking the awkward questions, far less good at coming up with any coherent answers. We leave that to the politicians, really, to come up with the answers, and then we just criticise what they do.
Quite right. Well, let's go on to our next clip then, to save you from coming up with any policy solutions. That one I found incredibly chilling, and I think we should clarify for at least one member of the audience, those aren't real heads. There is something really disturbing about the way she sort of justifies the brutalities by saying, we're a new state. It's a sort of, you know, if you want an omelette, we need to break eggs justification. Was that something that came across quite strongly in the research?
Okay, there's a lot to say about that. The first thing to say is, despite the fact that the language is lampooned by the Daily Mail as being the invention of a sort of metropolitan lovey, that is literally verbatim from a blog from a woman who was in the Islamic State, now no longer alive. I just edited it a little bit, but I didn't change it really in any way. I just shortened it. The words are hers, not mine. My contribution was the juxtaposition. So what those of you who've seen the show will know is that just prior to that, in episode 2, Jalal has just witnessed a beheading of a Peshmerga fighter in the square in Raqqa, and he's been quite appalled by it. And then Shakira begins to speak in quite a downbeat way, and you think that it's picking up the same mood, but then slowly as the speech unrolls, you realize she's actually endorsing the Islamic State. So my contribution was that little dramatic game that I played with the characters and with the audience. But when I read that speech, the overwhelming sense that I got was, you're having doubts and you're trying to convince yourself. And so I have rendered that into the drama. Shakira is having doubts and she is online she's almost addressing herself rather than the sisters back home. And I thought that that was really interesting, that she was almost giving herself a good talking to, because she had sacrificed, as she says in episode 1, she had sacrificed everything for this journey. She's an intelligent woman, and she was starting to wonder whether she'd made the right decision. But that was such a dark path for her, involving so, a realization that she had made such a all-consuming error, a life-defining error, really, that she was struggling to hang on to her conviction. And I thought that speech from the research perfectly enabled me to convey that sense with Shakira. And I thought the way she describes jihad, not in the way it's come to be used, but in terms of struggle, and if I felt something there that told me a lot about her as a character and about some of the people who do this. It's this quest for purity. I know that seems bizarre in the context of, of the disgusting regime that the Islamic State is. But in this strange, weird way, there is somewhere in there a muddled, wrong-headed quest for purity. And she was almost trying to talk herself back into that by listing these ingredients of how she interpreted the word jihad. Now look, this show's intended, as I said to you before, as an antidote to simplistic thought. This is not easy, this stuff, because it's like, looking at the Nazis and trying to sort of find some understandable motivation for people involved in genocide. It's not a pretty or a particularly attractive thing to even attempt to do, but I've always believed that you can't combat something unless you properly understand it. And if you look at the intelligence services, and I've spent quite a bit of time with them, they are deeply involved in this process of trying to understand their enemy. And we should too.
Let's just talk about the look of the whole thing. I mean, it had a very filmic look. Why did you take that decision?
Well, I shoot everything handheld. So I suppose I'm trying to make it feel immediate and real. But these days, news coverage, documentary coverage is in high definition. It's not all grainy 16mm.
As is ISIS propaganda.
ISIS propaganda makes this look positively clunky. So, yeah, I'm trying to write and film in the vernacular, if you like, in the language appropriate to the events. You won't see any dollies or crane shots or 360 circular tracks, or but you will, is this? Oh, it's not so down there, but not up there. The emblematic image is following someone into a room. The characters are leading us on a journey of discovery, and it is their journey of discovery. And so, in the end, that stylistic choice governed the way we made the show, visually at least.
And were there any particular challenges of scenes that were really difficult to visually construct, either because they contained brutalities or...
Were there any that
sure there were several,
but... Yeah, there were so many different challenges and difficulties. First of all, we couldn't get anywhere near the Arab world because it was too difficult and too dangerous. We couldn't get insurance for a 250-strong film crew. It's not like going in doing a bit of guerrilla documentaries, the kind I used to do years ago. This is a great big machine with heavy trucks, and it leaves a very noticeable trail wherever it goes. Secondly, by its nature and because of the age of the main characters, I was not going to be able to rely on very experienced actors. So a number of these people, although I surrounded them with actors I'd already worked with from the Arab world, who I knew were really strong, a number of whom I'd worked with in The Promise, which is another show which we're not talking about tonight, which I did for Channel 4. But the main characters were tremendously inexperienced, and that presented its own challenges. Then we had children, and one child in particular, who needed to appear to witness some horrendous things, but couldn't witness anything in reality because we had to protect him at all costs. So I had to use all the tricks and subterfuge to try to create the sense that he was seeing horrible things and rely on his acting ability.
And what did you tell him, that he was just seeing something awful? But
I just said, you're seeing something really horrible. And, you know, we did his stuff, we took him away, and then we shot what he was seeing. You know, when he appears to be looking at heads on railings, he's looking at crosses, you know, with gaffer tape. Listen, you know, it's an RTS audience, you know the tricks we use, but that was challenging, you know, and if you're trying to make the thing very realistic and you've got to engage in that level of artifice, you know, it slows it down, has to be done little bit by little bit, you lose that flow. And then we had people walking around dressed as fighters from the Islamic State in the middle of southern Spain.
Yes.
An area with quite a large Muslim population. And these images were on the news every day. I don't mean images of us, I mean the real images.
Yes.
And, you know, for the producer, Steve Clark Hall and Alex Sutherland, the Spanish line producer, you know, these were immensely difficult challenges, and we had a number of problems which affected the way we were able to shoot it. So, you know, when I say it's the most difficult thing I've ever done, you know, that's from the heart, really.
Well, I'm conscious of time, and I know that people in the audience will have questions. So if you could just stick your hand up. I think we've got a microphone there. Oh, if you could just tell us who you are as well, that'd be great.
Sure, yeah. I'm Jeff Norton. Peter, I'm really curious. Earlier you were talking about the sort of doom and gloom state of the world, and one of the things, the parallels, I'm curious, with your journalistic lens of the radicalization of the folks that you've depicted in the drama, as compared to people, say, who've been flocking to the alt-right, voting for Trump, or people in Cornwall voting for Brexit. You know, I'm curious, that type of radicalization through media, whether it's Fox News in the US or ISIS videos on YouTube, what parallels with your journalistic perspective do you see between radicalization to the fringe, no matter what the fringe happens to be?
That's interesting.
Yeah, I do, listen, I'll answer the question to the best of my ability, but I'm just another guy, you know. In the end, my opinion is no more important, interesting, or valid than yours or anyone else's in this room. You know, I read the same stuff you read in general. The only perhaps thing is I'm quite old and have seen quite a lot of this stuff over the years. I suppose my sense of, you know, 20th century history is that at times of economic difficulty, people move to the fringes. And I certainly feel that there is, as I said earlier, that there's a sort of charisma vacuum in the middle. That there's a lack of a narrative which is persuasive in the middle. And that, you know, people who feel dispossessed are moving to the fringe, to the alt-right, to Brexit. Now, they have their narrative, which might start in West Virginia with the closing down of the mines, you know. They have their narrative. Each individual person has their narrative. But there's a different narrative for people who end up here. And I personally believe it begins with things like the Iraq War, and it moves through things like Camp Bucca, which was and the disbanding of the Iraqi army, you know, and other mistakes that were made, and some of the legislative decisions that were made around the time of the 7/7 bombings into where we are today. Now that's a narrative. I'm not defending it. I think the conclusions those people have come to are completely wrong-headed and evil. But that's a narrative in the same way that somebody who might end up at at a Trump rally probably has a narrative. It may be also based on misconceptions, but there's a narrative that has led them to that position. That's the only commonality that I can see, really.
You spoke actually on that subject half an hour ago very powerfully about our present state of discontent. Is that your next play?
Thanks, Ivor. My next project is a long holiday, actually. I certainly, trilogy is a nice round number, and I don't have any plans to return to this subject again, but then who knows?
Why don't we see another clip, and then we can take a few more questions. Now, just for those who haven't seen, can you just very briefly explain what the context of that clip is?
Sure. The first thing to remember is that this is a unit made up of expats, of people coming from overseas. There are other units that are Iraqis and Tunisians and Moroccans and Algerians and Libyans and they have been moved up to a village near Deir ez-Zor for a battle with Assad's forces, and they've come through a village where ethnic cleansing is taking place. Muslims who are from the Shia are being beheaded and raped, and it's a very, very bloody scene, probably the bloodiest scene in the show. And Jalal, quotes scripture at his commander Abu Omar, played by Ali Suleiman.
That's the chap we see speaking Arabic.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Who's, as I said, a guy I worked with in The Promise, and he says, how does this gel with what we're taught, in the Hadith and in the Quran? And one of his psychics says, in a minute you'll understand. And they take them up to see the Sunni dead. And the suggestion is that when Assad's forces went through the village, they separated out the Sunnis and raped the women and killed them and shot the men with a bullet to the brain. And this is obviously intended to sort of gee people up ready for the battle that's to come that night.
And obviously they're shown this very brutal scene of dead bodies, but we don't know the reality of those dead bodies, what they are, if they are indeed what the chap is telling us. So there's a sort of murky reality there, isn't there?
Precisely, yeah.
The other thing that we thought was interesting about that particular character is, and again, for those who've seen will know this, that he is someone who was previously in the Iraqi army under Saddam. Can you just tell me a little bit about that? Yeah,
it's again drawn from the research. People who know a bit about the Islamic State will know that there's al-Baghdadi, who may or may not now be dead, who's the caliph, but for the longest time, his two immediate deputies were former generals from Saddam's army. Now, those who know a bit about the history of the Iraq War and Saddam know that there was no love lost between the jihadis and Saddam. It was for the longest time, Iraq under Saddam was essentially a secular state. And although Saddam started practicing his religion a bit more towards the end, and the Mujahideen were essentially locked up under Saddam and tortured. What the Americans did, and I suppose us, when we went in, was we put them all together. We disbanded the Iraqi army, the Sunni army by and large, and we put them all into this place called Camp Bucca, all together. The jihadists and the army, they'd hated each other, and then they just sort of locked the door. It was like putting all the ingredients into a pot and closing it up, putting some heat under it and going off for half an hour, giving it the occasional stir with a bit of brutality, And of course, when you pour the contents out, you have a group of people who've made common cause. And that's what the Islamic State is. That's where it has its origins, in Camp Booker. And I thought it was important to show that by having one of the military commanders as a former colonel in Saddam's army, and he was asked where he'd learned his English, and he said in Camp Booker. And it's a reference to the fact that there are professional soldiers within the ranks of the ISIS military, and they are by and large Iraqis who have made common cause with the jihadists as a result of what happened at the end of the Iraq War.
And I think it was really interesting that you put that in. It's obviously true to the research, because it reminds us that you've got someone who was involved in the secular army who has now proclaimed some sort of allegiance to a theological state. And again, it draws you back to your research, where perhaps it's a veneer.
Well, it's hard to speak about the absolute upper echelons of the organisation. I wasn't able to do much research about them, and generally speaking, my dramas tend to operate at the ground floor level, really. But there's no doubt that the research, you'll know this because you've reported on it. The academics have been trying to find a common factor between, the people from all over Europe, even as far afield as Australia, the so-called Western countries who have travelled. And they seem to come from a variety of socio-economic backgrounds. They seem to come from a variety of different educational attainments. Some have a criminal past, undoubtedly, but some don't. The only common factor seems to be, as I said earlier, this shallow association with faith. They're either converts or people who've relatively recently been born again. So these are essentially disillusioned and dispossessed people in one form or another who have wrapped themselves in this cloak of faith because it satisfies some kind of a need in them. And, the analysis would need to be to break down the detail of that need. But I suppose what I'm trying to say is I think that need is not unfamiliar. We have seen it manifest in previous organizations in earlier times. And I mentioned some precursor organizations. I think anyone who thinks this is about Islam is missing the point.
Mm-hmm. We have got another clip, but I do want to go to the audience if we've got points there. Yes.
Hello, Peter. Thank you so much for making the series. I'm sure everybody would want to thank you for that. And thank you particularly for the female characters, who I think are absolutely fascinating. In the first episode particularly, it showed me a side that I simply haven't seen before, I think, to see the situation through their eyes. I actually had a question about what happens to the series when it's shown outside the UK, because I understand it's a co-production with National Geographic, and so they'll be showing it in many territories, I hope all of them. What do you expect the reaction is going to be from other audiences to this, particularly in countries where there's maybe an equal problem with radicalisation and they deal with it not very well? How do you think they're going to react to this? Is this going to be a series about British Muslims, or do you think it's going to be a series about the radicalisation of all young people?
Yeah, that's a very good question. Thank you. Well, National Geographic have bought the show. They're in about 190 territories worldwide, I think, and the position they've taken is that their affiliates don't need to transmit it if they don't want to, which is disappointing but understandable. So it won't necessarily be shown in every one of those territories. I hope it'll be shown in a fair number. But it's interesting that 2 territories in particular have asked for an advanced window, France and Australia. And in fact, it's being shown in France on the 4th of September, starts on the 4th of September on Canal+, and it's already transmitting in Australia. So they've persuaded Nat Geo to let them run it early. And I think it's probably not a coincidence that, you know, there have been terrorist outrages in both those territories. I was in America recently publicizing the show, and somebody said to me there, for you, in other words, in Britain, this is domestic policy. This is domestic. For us, it's about what foreigners are doing in foreign countries. And I thought that was interesting because there are a number of Americans out there, and I depicted one. They haven't had these terrorist outrages on their streets yet. I mean, they're more in. I mean, there've been examples, but you know, not to the same extent. And there's so much violence on, you know, so many sort of shootings at Columbine and similar, that it doesn't get the same kind of visibility that it does here. There's no doubt that in front of a knowledgeable audience, this was seen as a foreign curiosity. And I think that's really interesting, that it hasn't impinged on America. I mean, in fairness, they are so caught up in the appalling soap opera they're living through at the moment, that it is very hard to get their attention. And I did an interview with Fox News just 2 days ago, live, and I was ready to be combative. You know, I thought, well, here it comes. And it was actually it was nothing like I expected. It was very curious and puzzled and intrigued. I think because we are living this here, in London, in Manchester, you know, in Barcelona, in Paris, in Belgium, in Germany, it feels very immediate. It doesn't feel like that in America at the moment. It may come to, but it doesn't at the moment.
And I mean, you say there, Peter, we are living this. Obviously, we've lived it to an extent, but people in Syria and Iraq are really living it. There was a Syrian character that we meet, and, you know, we follow his journey. He's obviously quite important to Jalal's story. How conscious were you to not make it too focused on just the British characters? Because obviously the Syrians and the Iraqis are the ones who are really feeling it.
Well, this is always the difficulty. You know, and I find this the hardest thing, really. You know, our way in often tends to be British characters. The way to get the audience to engage is to create a character where the challenge of the piece is that there is a certain amount of there, but for the grace of God, go I, or somebody I know. If your entire cast is Iraqi or Syrian, it's harder to do that. It can be done, but it's harder. So what I focused on in the research was the stories of people, and they were always the ones who had some Arabic, who had made friends and contacts with the Ansari, as they call them, you know, the locals. We had Dr. Rabia, and of course we also had Ibtisam and Nareen, who were Yazidi mother and daughter, and they became important in Jalal's life. And then, of course, we had the characters like Abu Masood, who Ushna marries, and then, you know, the ISIS characters like Abu Akram, who's the hospital, and Abu Omar and others. So I was trying to have a representative cast of characters as could conceivably be encountered by people from outside, such as our main characters. But you're right, that is the challenge.
Okay. We've probably got time for a couple more questions. Yes, Frank.
I've rarely had an evening as strong as this, so thank you. You made one sentence earlier on where you said you were trying intellectually to understand this. And yet the subject matter is emotional, isn't it? And the last time we did this, we behaved as a nation like this, was when we were Christian and we decided to tear one another to bits. But when we did that, we had a common language, so we understood, we thought, why we were doing it. You've made this great series against a background where we in this country don't understand what belief is about. It's unintelligible to us. It's a barrier to meaning rather than actually a purveyor of meaning. So in a sense, your achievement is twofold, isn't it? One, to give us the storyline from where this all began, but also to try and break through this fence where people don't think normally that people can be moved by religion rather than trivia, really, because that's what religion has been replaced with largely in this country. Nothing wrong with trivia, it can be quite good stuff, but it's a very different framework to the framework that you've been talking about. We've seen pictures of them, and the three films that you've discussed this evening, so huge thanks. And that's why I think politicians here more trivialise than they would do, because they've neither map nor compass to guide them.
That's a big subject, Frank. No, it's okay. It's interesting that you should say that, because the thing I did before this was Wolf Hall, and that was about exactly that period. And I've commented before on the weird parallels, although they break down as soon as you start to think about them in any detail, between the disgusting punishments that Henry VIII was doling out to people who didn't agree with his particular interpretation of Christianity, and they bear a striking resemblance to some of the punishments that the Islamic State were carrying out inside the so-called caliphate. And but I suppose, to get to the sort of crux of your question, and again, I just say this is, I don't have any expertise here. I'm just a program maker who's been reading some stuff, but my feeling is that I remember when I was young, a lot younger than I am now, I was very attracted by absolute ideas. It's a cliche and a truism, but you see things in very black and white terms when you're younger, and then as you get older, you realize the world is just a sort of mushy grey, really. I'm not so sure, particularly with the people who went out there who, famously, in one case, carrying Islam for Dummies in their rucksack, I don't know that it's so tempting to think about it as religion, because that's the very manifest iconography of the Islamic State. But I'm not sure that that really fully helps us understand. I think it's more to do with where those people were in their lives, how they perceived themselves within society, and what they thought the solutions were. And that's why I think that is more akin to people, in the 70s, who were attracted by a radical anarchistic ideas, where they thought that killing people or blowing things up would somehow deliver more the society that they wanted. Now, listen, this is just a point of view. A number of academics have posited this, so this is not something I'm suggesting. I'm just parroting back at you the stuff I've read. But in terms of all the research we did over 18 months, it does make more sense to me than thinking that this is some schism within Islam, some different bit of Islam. When you look at the willful misinterpretation of scripture, that it's like sort of looking at some line in the Bible that legitimizes the stoning to death of someone who, a homosexual, and thinking that that is in some way indicative of Christianity. And it's the same selective type of Leviticus type of quoting. I don't think that, I think we delude ourselves if we think it's about that. That's a symptom rather than the cause. I think it's more important to try to think, and that's why I'm talking about the Iraq War and George Bush's policies and those kinds of things, that we have to look at the world into which this generation was born and the things that they have experienced and have been discussed within their peer group, just as it was necessary to look at those environmental, if you like, issues when you're looking at why people joined the Baader-Meinhof group back in the day.
Thank you. I think we'll take that last question. That was just...
Peter, thanks for being on Island, first of all. I watched this with my 3 teenage children, which was quite a brave thing to do. And we've talked about it a lot. And they asked me 2 questions. They said, one of them said, "Dad, will we ever be at peace in the world?" And the second one said, "Isn't religion the cause of all the violence and all the war?" And I said, I don't know. And I haven't been able to answer them.
Ask Peter.
Exactly.
There you go, Peter.
Well, I read somewhere over a line by a rather wonderful comedian who you'll all know, saying that that Donald Trump was actually a distress flare sent up by the planet to outer space to come and terminate us as a species, or at least to say that we were in terrible trouble and we needed outside help. I think the difficulty, to pick up the spirit of your question, the difficulty that we face as parents when we're talking to our children now, and I guess my children may be a similar age to yours, is where to find hope for them. Because we look around and we are in a very dark place. And when they ask us those questions that only children can encapsulate so eloquently, how do we answer them? Will we ever be at peace? I look at the human race and I despair, really, and I think, do we deserve to survive? We're so brutal. And we have this veneer of civilization, but underneath these dark forces, which have been, which we see manifest within our society at the moment, and certainly within America, are lurking just below the surface, looking for an excuse, really, to be manifest. And so this is going to come out like a horrible cliche, and I apologize, but one of the things that I've made films about aid workers in the past, and one of the things that they always say is, in these darkest times, you see the best in humanity as well as the worst in humanity. And I was listening to somebody on the radio at lunchtime today from the NHS talking about how the NHS swung into action in Manchester after the appalling outrage that happened there just a few weeks ago. And she said, the weird thing was, despite all the cuts and despite all the the fact that their morale is in the toilet, thanks to our wonderful Secretary of State, God bless him, she thought she saw the best of the NHS in action that night. People just coming in who weren't on duty, staying for hours, so that it kind of chokes you up, really. So I suppose we are a sort of glorious contradiction, aren't we? We have this ability for great darkness and also great light, all somehow jostling within the same crucible. I suppose the only thing we can hope on behalf of our children is that the light will eventually outshine the darkness.
Yeah. Well, on that note. I think that is a perfect note. Yeah, and thank you very much, Peter. As a man who describes himself as a program maker who's been making some stuff or reading some stuff, I think I prefer a commitment to making those in power feel queasy, and long may it continue. Peter Kosminsky.